Who are finishing up getting your food could take a seat, that would be great. I am happy that you're all here to join us and celebrate the TIM Distinguished Scholar for this year. I'm Mary Tripsis. I'm the chair of the TIM division this year, or this coming year. So it's my honor to welcome you all and to introduce today someone whom I was trying to think back to when I first met Carliss. So we have Carliss Baldwin with us to honor, and Carliss is the William L. White Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. So I first saw Carliss back in 1993 when I was a doctoral student at MIT, and there was a seminar over at Harvard that she was presenting at. And as most doctoral students tend to be, I was impressed and intimidated and thought, wow, who is this amazing woman? And have had the honor to get to know her a little bit better over the years. For those of you who don't know Carliss, let me give you a little bit of background, and then I've got some comments from folks who've worked more closely with her over the years. So Harvard hired Carliss, surprisingly, in a department that those of you who are technology and innovation scholars may be surprised at. Well, she's in the finance department, right? She did her undergraduate in economics at MIT and then an MBA and DBA at the Harvard Business School. And she studied finance under Robert Merton, Franco Modigliani. So you're thinking, well, okay, this is a finance person, and yet here we are, the technology and innovation management division. This doesn't make sense, right? But those of us who study innovation know that one of the findings that many people have talked about is that the most creative and innovative work tends to happen at the intersection of disciplines, right? And so I think Carliss is kind of the poster child for that sort of research, in the sense that she really is one of the most truly interdisciplinary scholars that you'll find. And so her work has sort of been fundamental in making contributions, in particular, to research on the evolution of complex systems, on modularity, on open architectures, intellectual property, and real options. Many of you may be familiar with her book, Design Rules, The Power of Modularity, with Kim Clark. I guess I have one quick question. How many of you have thought of the title of Design Rules as being a pun? Oh, only one, two, three. So I must admit that it hadn't occurred to me when I first saw the book or the title, right? But the book, for those of you who haven't read it, it absolutely should be on your top list of things to read. But given the number of languages it's published in, it's a very, very well-known book. So Design Rules, right? So what does it say? It says two things. So the first is design rules, right? As in the power of modularity. So in the book, she and Kim show how design decisions at the product level, right, have implications at the level of the economy, right, of value creation at a very high level. So we've got multiple levels of analysis. So in the sense of design is powerful in rules is sort of the first meaning of rules. And then, of course, the second is the book lays out a set of design rules, as in ways that we would think about defining interfaces between different parts of a system, and this set of rules is a sort of systematic way to think about design. So I'm going to guess that that was intentional in the title. And so now those of you who hadn't thought about that in such a deep way can say, yeah, I get the pun. I'm an insider now. So I said when I first met Carliss, or saw Carliss, I was sort of intimidated, and then she next sort of showed up on my radar screen when I was a junior faculty at the Wharton School, and she gave a talk about the work she was doing on design. And at that point, it dawned on me, and those of you who are going to consortia and such may have had this realization sooner, that these amazing, famous, super intelligent people can actually be really nice human beings. And so I remember getting one of those, 30-minute slots with Carliss, and I was just awed at how she, in that 30 minutes, and you, I'm sure, probably don't even remember this, Carliss, was listened, had interesting and thoughtful things to say, and was just super helpful even in that short period of time. And then when I moved to the Harvard Business School subsequently, and I will say I was on the faculty there for 13 years, and I don't often say super nice things about many of my colleagues from those years, and Carliss was amazing, right? So I thought, well, maybe it's just because I'm so special. She was so nice to me, but in preparation for this, I talked to some of her colleagues that she's worked with over the years, and so I just wanted to read you a few of the things that those folks have said in emails back and forth. So one of her colleagues, and this theme comes through in all of these, her qualities as a colleague can be summed up in one word: generosity. Even though she's a highly accomplished and world-recognized scholar, she remains accessible to students and colleagues. Another person described her as unbelievably enthusiastic and encouraging, positive with everyone she comes in contact with. And then finally, she's more generous with her time than any co-author I have worked with. She doesn't just know your work, she knows you, and she cares about you. So clearly, it's not just me. It's all of the people that she works with have sort of a similar feeling. So I want to close with something that Eric von Hippel, who Carliss has been working with recently, sent to me when I told him that we were going to be honoring her as our distinguished scholar. Eric says, "You are honoring one of the world's most outstanding researchers in the field of technology and innovation management. I congratulate both Professor Baldwin and Tim." So with that, I am indeed honored to hand the floor over to Carliss. Thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations.
Thank you, Mary. Give me just a minute to open my notes. Let me say how deeply honored I am, and I would like to thank everyone in the TIM division, and especially Mary, for such a wonderful introduction. And I do very clearly remember not the MIT interaction, but when I met Mary at Wharton, and I was then not just a co-author of Kim Clark, but I was the dean of recruiting. And I flew back to Boston. I said to Kim, "We have to hire this woman." And so we did. One of the things I'm most proud of in my time as that dean. I'm here, and I understand the format is that I will talk for some number of minutes. I haven't timed this talk, and then there will be a chance for questions, and I hope people will ask questions, open forum, and anything academic or within reason personal. My husband is here, so please don't embarrass me. But I owe many things to him, and Design Rules is actually dedicated to, by Kim and myself, to our loving and understanding families who were both loving and understanding through the very many years that it took to get the book done. My fundamental interest has for a long time been to understand how new technologies both enable and reward new organizational forms. And Robert Merton was one of my teachers, but Alfred Chandler was another teacher. Much of my work has been an attempt to extend his theory, which is often misinterpreted as being technologically deterministic, to extend his theory to predict organizational forms that are created under new technologies, particularly the new technologies, new information technologies. However, as Mary said, I started out in finance, and I'll bore you with a little bit of my saga. My original work was on real options, and the first thing I want to say to all the younger people here is get tenure first, because then you are free. After I got tenure at Harvard Business School, I looked at my pipeline and I said, you know, this real options stuff it's not, it doesn't have the leverage I want it to have, because all of the models of real options at the time, we'd go through this big, this big rigmarole, very fancy mathematical modeling. And when push came to shove, the real options, when you took them into account, they would increase the value of the base project by between 25% to maybe 75%. So you went from 1 to 1.25 to maybe 1.50 or 1.75. And I said, that's not a lot of bang for this buck. So Kim Clark was then head of the TOM group at Harvard Business School and invited me to come over and begin to learn about technology. And I took him up on that invitation because I didn't want to be about like a 25% bump. And I thought technology would give me a bigger bump for, more bang for the buck. And this was the late 80s. 87, 88. And believe it or not, modularity was in the air back then, but it was all modularity in production systems and in new product development. Kim and I wrote what was supposed to be a quick paper, quick hit, showing how option theory could be applied to demonstrate the value of modularity. Because at that time also there was a lot of noise about how finance was destroying the wonderful world of technology. That you know, it was the finance guys coming in with their pencils and their models and their capital budgeting rules, and nobody was getting to make a strategic investment again. Now, I used to say to my students, a strategic investment is one you overpay for. I think that is true. But I also said to Kim that if we use the right finance theory, we can demonstrate the value of these things that you think are really, really value creating. And that was our objective. So we wrote a paper showing how option theory could be applied to demonstrate the value of modularity. And we submitted the paper to Management Science. This was probably 1993, where it went through 3 rounds of refereeing. And in those days, Management Science was not known for its speed. So this 3 rounds of refereeing took more than 3 years. And I think it only went through that many rounds because Kim was famous and the editors didn't want to turn him down. So on the last round, we had 5 reviews, 4 from referees and 1 from the associate editor, all of which said different things. 3 of which indicated complete lack of comprehension of what option theory actually said, which we were trying to squeeze down to a manageable number of pages. And then they said, oh, and by the way, cut 30% out of the paper. So at that point, I went to Kim, I said, you know, this is a rejection where they say you have a revise and resubmit, but they're really rejecting it. And we decided to give up on journals in general and write a book, since I didn't see and Kim didn't see any way we could get the idea packaged into 35 pages, since clearly people weren't understanding what we were even talking about. So Design Rules, the book, actually got written backwards. Because the management science paper became the core of what is now chapter 10. And we found that we couldn't even begin to make sense to people unless we built an infrastructure of what is a module, because modules hadn't really been well defined. People knew them when they saw them, except my finance colleagues, none of whom ever believe you should ask a manager anything. They did not believe modules really existed. We began to write the earlier chapters and built up a theoretical infrastructure of concepts and evidence. But the saga continues, because first we tried to write a management book, an accessible book, a book that people would read. Based on everyday examples and some light arguments. And in 1995, I sent Kim an email. We had the whole draft written, and I read it. I'd put it away for 2 months. I read it. And I said the draft didn't hack it. I was totally embarrassed. We were going to have to abandon this draft. And 3 months later, Kim became dean of the Harvard Business School. But he continued to be involved. We started over with a new set of standards. These were the design rules of design rules. That all concepts and techniques would be validated with evidence. That was, and since these concepts and techniques were not known, we had to get the evidence from all kinds of different places. From a single group of technologies. So we would invest heavily in one set of technologies, ask our readers to understand that group, and forget about all other technologies. So we picked information that we would use both technical and economic data and interleave it, and that there would be no metaphors, especially no biological metaphors. Because this was the heyday of complexity theory, and everybody was porting biology over to management left and right. So these rules made the effort extremely labor intensive. Randy can testify to that. The years went by, and then we came up with the lessons, which I will, the years went by, and this is what came out. So these are the lessons of design rules. The modularity is created. Modular structures are an artificial thing that people set about with various amounts of difficulty or ease to actually make systems modular. That modular designs in turn, this was the finance part. So that's chapters 1 through 9, is how do you create modularity. Chapter 10 is that modular designs in turn create options, and that modular designs evolve through decentralized trial and error, and that they are capable of blowing industries apart. And we got points 1 to 3 pretty well settled in the book, and we pointed to point 4, but you know, that's still a work in progress. We can, for reasons that I'll get into. So first, that modularity is created, and you do it in the following way. First, you must understand the dependencies, the true dependencies between what you can loosely call the design decisions or the components of the system. So this is one of what became our favorite tools, except that the first time, when I first read the paper by Eppinger and others about design structure matrices, for me it was like a eureka moment. I said, this is what I've been waiting for. I went to Kim and I said, Kim, we need design structure matrices. And Kim said, that is so obscure and geeky, Carliss, I can't believe you're even talking about them. So we had a bit of an argument about that. But what they allow you to do is address the issue my finance colleagues had was, are modules real? Do they really exist? And if you see a large system as a network of design decisions, some of which are clustered and some of which are more loosely connected, and you actually try to perceive those dependencies and map them, you will see, and there, that works really well, that design decision here will affect through this channel that design decision, and that design decision may come and affect one of these design decisions, and these pathways through the network can very easily lead to, first, a lot of time, and second, to cycles. And designers of technical systems often talk about cycles as, well, you may enter into a cyclic dependency and never come out, because there's no guarantee that the thing is going to converge on anything in your lifetime. So the way you create modularity is being aware now of these dependencies, and it takes a lot of experience and learning to simply know where the dependencies are. You can, if you have that instinct, say, well, I would like not to relive that cycle over again. I kind of have seen how the decisions come out both ways, so I'm going to create a rule up here, and that rule is going to be binding on several decisions, and by creating that rule, the designers won't have to talk to each other along the way. They will not have to resolve the dependency because I, the architect, will have resolved the dependency for them, and they will follow my rule. If you do that enough times, and with the idea, so what I'm trying to get across is, this does not happen by accident. Generally, there's an architect or a team of architects who sees some utility in a modular structure, and they go and attack those intercomponent dependencies with a vengeance and come out with a new network where there are a lot of design rules affecting different parts of the system, and the actual modules themselves are still tightly interdependent within the modules, but independent across the modules. And this also has the property of what goes on within the modules does not have to be known. This set of designers does not have to know what this set of designers is doing, as long as both are following the rules. And that turns out to be a very honored principle in design theory and computer science called information hiding. So this structure gives you both, keeps fruitful interdependence within modules, creates independence across, and hides information. And because this doesn't happen perfectly, you often need a bunch of systems integrators at the end of the process to resolve some of the things that these guys didn't think about. And if you're not lucky, then the systems integrators will find that there are unknown dependencies and the whole structure will collapse. But if it doesn't, then you now have a new architecture, and it has several properties. One is first of all, it reduces cognitive complexity. Second, it allows parallel work on modules. And third, and what for me was so important and interesting and fascinating, is that in the interdependent case, you basically, by the time you got done resolving all those conflicts and cyclicalities, you either take the system or you leave it. It succeeds or it fails. You're not going to go in and tweak any of those hard-won design decisions. But if you achieve a nice modular structure with the design rules, then each of those individual options you can play around with. So the architecture is tolerant of uncertainty, and if you say tolerant of uncertainty to a finance person, they immediately think option. This architecture is full of options, and that optionality can be analyzed using financial tools. So take it or leave it. And here, because you have options, you can mix and match the best outcomes of many experiments. And that was the highest level insight, the first insight, the thing that driving down the Mass Pike from Boston to Stockbridge. James Taylor drove from Stockbridge to Boston. I drive from Boston to Stockbridge. That this structure is option-rich. And that has implications for value creation. So here's a way of showing that the modules, on this axis is the number of modules, on this axis is the number of experiments, and if you increase both, you get hugely large amounts of value potentially being created. So this is 25 modules and 25 experiments per module, which is sort of the dimensions of System 360. And you can see that the value of this system goes from being 1 to, it goes up by 25 times. Now, a 25 times increase in value to consumers will pay for a whole lot of architects and experimenters. And if you ignore that kind of value, one of the things I said to my TOM colleagues when I was very much younger, and they were talking about how TOM, TIM really encompassed all disciplines except finance. And I said, you guys don't understand finance. You don't do finance, finance does you. This kind of value proposition from a financial perspective is unstoppable. The economy will rearrange itself in all kinds of different ways. Old organizations will disappear, new organizations will appear. They'll all be funded by rapacious venture capitalists and other financiers, and they will get the job done, and to hell with you if you're in their way. So I said, I'd found my, I didn't want the factor of 0.25, I got a factor of 25. And I said to Kim, I said, this is what we have to explore because this is unstoppable. And that was in 1993. I didn't predict the subsequent developments, as I'll show, but I was very sure that we were going to see radical rearrangements of economic relationships as a result of this, this value created. Next thing to know, because those options are not controlled by a central party, modular designs will evolve through decentralized trial and error. So that's the next prediction is that not only will you have a lot of experiments and a lot of modules and a lot of value, but much of the work will not need to be centrally coordinated, which if you were at Harvard Business School in the early 90s was like an anathema. It didn't make you very popular, even if you were dean, to say, oh, we're seeing the end of big corporations. And then last point, modular designs are capable of blowing industries apart, and here was where we went to look for evidence, both of the origins of modularity in the computer industry and of the advent of modular designs blowing industries apart. So I'm quite confident, I can say with confidence, that the very first large-scale modular system was invented by IBM within the corporate structure. It was System 360. The reason they modularized had to do with customer demand, that they had Moore's Law working for them in hardware, so they could replace hardware very frequently. They had cognitive limits working against them in software, so they really needed to slow down. If you had to rewrite all your software every time you introduced new hardware, you were dead in the water. And so they figured out a way to separate the hardware from the software. And in so doing, They created a whole bunch of modules, and this is the design structure matrix that we retrospectively set up, identifying each separate thing that they did. That was the structure that they foresaw and actually used to define their corporate strategy from approximately 1964 to 1968, when they rolled out System 360 into the market. What then happened between 1968, first plug-compatible peripheral companies opened its doors in 1969. And by 1980, hundreds of firms made System 360 plug-compatible components. At the same time, all the companies that made large computer systems, Burroughs and GE exited the computer business, Burroughs, Honeywell, what is now called Unisys, they all fled into niches where they can set up barriers to entry. But these modular competitors, IBM did not want to have a whole slew of companies, mostly staffed by its own exiting engineers, leaving the San Jose research laboratory. They planned to sell all the pieces of System 360 themselves. So this was anathema. They did two things. They sent a task force out to the San Jose labs to figure out how to make the engineers happier. And that task force recommended new curtains. And they sued the pants off of all these companies that they could on multiple grounds. And when the dust settled 10 years later, the intellectual property law was decided in favor of IBM. But the horse was out of the barn. There was no way to put history back into the box, and Silicon Valley and a whole ecosystem of computer-based firms, and importantly disk drive firms, were at the forefront, had been formed. This was the way we graphically summarize this industry event. The blue mountain range in the back is IBM. And you can see that is the point where they introduced System 360, and that's the point where the market realized that the plug-compatible companies were for real. So IBM took a big hit when the market realized that it would not monopolize all the pieces of System 360. And then these are the SIC. This is old data, so these are the SIC codes. Market value of the sum of the companies in each of the SIC codes. And then we broke out Microsoft and Intel just for grins, and showed how they entered this graph as well. So this is the end of a Chandlerian industry. It just blew apart into its component pieces. Hundreds of firms came to be making computers, and IBM was never the same. This is a different way of seeing the same developments. This is joint work with Michael Jacobides, and Jen Tai has extended some of it, but this is the graphic we came up with. Andy Grove had talked in the early 90s, Andy Grove, CEO of Intel, talked in the 90s about the vertical to horizontal transition, and had a nice graphic in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, showing the vertical stacks, the vertical silos, and then the horizontal layered architecture of the new computer industry. So we went back to 1979, and we classified firms according to, were they vertically, were they in many different parts of the computer supplying many different things, or like Intel, were they specialized to, say, chips or computer systems design? And this is what we found. In 1979, there was IBM, Big Blue, accounting for about half the industry. And there were a bunch of other verticals that were important as well. Xerox, Unisys, Digital Equipment, Sperry, and then there were a bunch of specialized companies. You have HP, although HP was a systems company back then, it hadn't really gone into printers in a big way. And so you can see that this is a mixed model in '79, became horizontal in 2005. So these blocks I should be explaining. The area of the block corresponds to the market cap of the company in this year. So the total area of the square is the total market cap of the entire industry, all of these NACIS codes added up. White is, so we start with the largest firm that in 2005 is Microsoft. They show up here as an ISP and here as a software publisher. And then Intel, so you see IBM is now sunk to number 4, and the top 3 companies, Microsoft, Intel, and Cisco, are all concentrated in various components and not directly competing with one another, but supplying complementary components. And so this was Andy Grove's, Andy Grove both understood what was going on and was predicting what was going to happen over the next 10 years between 1994 and 2005. But we stood in 1998, having invested approximately 15 years of research time into this book. And the late 90s were, as I said this morning, in the 90s, from 1990 to 2000, an amazing range of digital artifacts were introduced into our society. You know, the World Wide Web, the internet had been invented but was diffused, and things like mobile telephony were starting up, just a whole host. So, and then the 2000s, we started to see new organizational forms. But I didn't have that clarity in 1998. I was just very confused because we had the internet, a stock market bubble that then crashed. The NASDAQ reached its high on March 6th of 2000, which was the day that design rules came out. Always burned in my memory, and it never went back to that height for many years. Open source software was out there, you know, just not really on the radar screen of business schools, but it was there. Mobile phones, and there was all this talk of digital convergence. Nobody knew how that was going to play out. And we had a manuscript that was clocking in at 500 pages. That's not 500 pages of double-space typing. That's 500 pages translated onto the page. And we'd only really written the history up to 1980. And so we made a decision to split the book into 2 parts. And moreover, that we were going to get everything up to 1980 right, and then we were just going to sit back and let events unfold and try to figure out what was going on. So that's that's how come Design Rules is called Volume 1, and 15 years later, Volume 2 is still in the works, I hope. So we published Volume 1, and Volume 2 was to follow. And the research since then and in the future has tried to, you know, pick up some of the threads of what we didn't understand. And I should say, in 2005, Kim, who was dean, received a call from his church to become president of Brigham Young University, Idaho. A great challenge for him, something he was very eager to do. And he went west, and we stopped working together. So this slide, which you can't read, and I was worried about that, but this is the most important slide I have to show you, because this is all the different strands of research with the debts I owe to many people, some of whom are in this room, and others who are spread to the four winds. So there's a strand on transactions, modularity, industry structure, and now bottlenecks, which I owe a great debt to Michael Jacobides, Zhangxi Lo, Lyra Colfer, helped by Margaret Jalzriel and Jen Tai. There's a strand, so it turns out, I said you could make something modular. That's if you know the underlying structure of a thing. It turns out quite shockingly, especially in software, people have no clue what the underlying modular structure of their system is. And they get it all wrong, and their modules are all dirty, and they come into, well, I'll show you what they actually create. But that's the hidden structure line, modularity and intellectual property with Joachim Henkel, platforms of all varieties with Jason Woodard, but also helped by Annabelle, who is here, by Olga, who is here, by Feng Zhu and Marco Iancidio, and many, many others that I can't even begin to list. And then there's new forms of organization, because in design rules, I knew about big firms and entrepreneurial firms, but I was a finance person, and I didn't know anything about organizations other than their big firms and their little firms. And then I learned about many new forms of organizations, and owe great debts to people here, to Hila, who's taught me a lot, to Sonali Shah, to Nuno, who's here, and other people who are not here. And the future, I think, is in understanding platforms and bottlenecks. I think we still have a lot of work to do. And so what are the headlines? First headline is that transactions are not, so Pache, Oliver Williamson, transactions are not a fundamental unit of analysis in a production or design system. There's a lot that goes on that's not a transaction unless you define everything as being a transaction. And I think it's better and more honest to draw on operations management, where they're unaware of transactions. Transactions take place outside the factory. What they design are tasks and transfers. And they spend a lot of time figuring out if the tasks and transfers are arranged in a way that is efficient and gets the job done. From that, you can say that most real work takes place in transaction-free zones, this is just a little schematic of a blacksmith, a smithy, and a kitchen, and between the smithy and the kitchen, you have a pothook. So the smithy makes the pothook, and the kitchen uses the pothook, and that's where you would put the transaction. But the smith himself has 5 helpers, or 4 helpers and the smith, and they're doing all kinds of things to get the job done. And similarly, the cook, the head cook, has 4 helpers, and they're not spending a lot of time negotiating who's going to do what. They're carrying out the job of cooking, because both blacksmithing and cooking are quite time sensitive. And if you sit around waiting for some agreement to happen or get held, the pothook's gonna melt, and the stew is gonna burn, and you're not gonna do your job. So you need to create these transaction-free zones, and I claim that governance of transaction-free zones is a new way to look at organization design. I'm not going to go deeply into that today because we have a session on Monday where we'll have a chance to talk about some of that. Second headline is, as I said, the true modular structure of a system is often not obvious. The true modules are often hidden. So here's the deal. You hire a bunch of developers, software developers or other engineers. If they're hardware engineers, the structure of the complex system, the iPhone, you can do a teardown and it will show you where the breakpoints are. But if it's something like a software system, it doesn't tell you how it's broken apart. The developers will claim that it is highly modular. And then in reality, they'll create completely dirty modules that will collapse into one big central thing called a core. So dirty modules are very common, and I will claim, and I've got data to support the contention, that open source software communities are better at creating and maintaining modular architectures than for-profit companies. I got 3 papers with Alan McCormick and others that show basically that. Why are they better? It could either be because their methods of organization enforce modularity. To enforce modularity inside a large company, you have to be Jeff Bezos, who published a rant, a manifesto in 2002 saying you would not have backdoors into your different software components, and if you created a backdoor, you would be fired, no kidding. And so their software is actually highly modular, which we're not supposed to know, but we do. Open source software has less technical debt because it's more modular, and technical debt can kill companies. Basically, that's what happened to BlackBerry. So here's what you have. Here's an illustration. This is a design structure matrix, a network graph of the hierarchy and cyclical dependencies in 3 systems that do basically the same thing: Linux, Darwin, and OpenSolaris. And this is the kernel of each of these operating systems. This is the pattern that we found over and over and over again in 80+% of the software systems that we ran through our algorithm. And I have a colleague at Stevens Institute of Technology, Babak Haidari, that says this can absolutely be derived from network theory, that a core periphery architecture is what will come out of an uncontrolled development process. And the big difference is the size of the core. So the core is, the way to look at this is, instructions come into the system from this part down here. They flow into the core. The core is cyclic, so they bounce around in the core, and they may end up stopping there or going to some shared stuff at the very top. So the core is where stuff is propagating, where the computer is going through a bunch of cycles, and where developers, when they have to change something, they have to worry about their changes propagating cyclically through this network of dependencies. So here you have Linux, core size of 7%, pretty small. Apple Darwin, core size of 16%. OpenSolaris, which is a Sun Microsystem creation, core size of 25%. And this core consists of 3,000 software files. So if you want to change something in Solaris, you could very easily walk into an interdependent cyclical system of 3,000 files, and you will never walk out. And there are supposedly only a very few extremely, well, let's say that as long as Solaris is alive, they have job security. Only an extremely few people who dare to venture into this place in the system. This is core size plotted against system size. Open systems are light and square, and systems created by for-profit companies are triangular and dark. And what you can see is pretty consistently in this envelope, the open systems are have a smaller percentage size of core than the proprietary systems. So that's why we feel somewhat confident in saying that open source software methods are more able. We're not sure whether it's their methods that create modularity or that the only open source software communities that survive have originally created a modular architecture for whatever reason, but there's a very strong correlation in the data. Third headline, an open source community is a sustainable enterprise among self-interested parties. There is no altruism needed For sustainability, only modularity and/or option value are needed. Participants, and importantly, because there was a lot of talk about, oh, free riders, they take down these communities. No. The contributors to open source software, the people really doing the work, they care about other contributors, they care about architecture, they really don't care about free riders from an economic perspective. And this is also one of the few, this is an aside in the paper on this topic, but this is one of the few institutions that can challenge an incumbent monopolist. Because for the most part, if a monopolist is really incumbent and you have a new entrant, then if the entrant succeeds, they'll split the market and you'll have an oligopoly and you can make it so it's not profitable for anyone to do that. But a community of users, which is what an open source community is, they will get the surplus, they can access the surplus, and so they will challenge the monopolist, as Linux in fact challenged Microsoft, and their software is better too. Last big finding I think is that, and this is quite recent, jumbled in my mind was some notion of modularity as being the way the system is split up, and complementarity, the Milgram-Roberts type, is the way the parts of the system interact to create value. And in the work with Joachim Henkel, we finally came to the realization that these are two entirely separate dimensions of the technology. Often they get conflated, but here is a mug. This is my mug, okay? My mug. And the notion of modularity is, can you break the pieces apart? And the notion of complementarity is, do you need all pieces to have a valuable artifact? So this is a mug. It has three pieces. It has a top, it has a handle, and it has a basin. And you need all three pieces to have a valuable mug, because a mug without a top doesn't work, and a mug without a handle doesn't work for me. So it's M of 3, and beta is the way we describe complementarity. Complementarity of 1 means all pieces are necessary for the system to have value. And you can quibble about handles and tops and things, but that's for me. So the iPhone hardware is, you can do a teardown. There are hundreds of modules in this artifact, and yet you need the whole thing to be valuable. So it's M of 100 plus and beta again of 1. And then this is something else. This is a living room. And here, I can swap out, I have about 100 modules. This isn't my living room, but it's one I like very much. There are about 100 modules, and I can take almost any one of them and take it out and put a different one in, if I happen to want to. So here, the artifact, the living room, the ambiance, is again created by many modules, but the complementarity among the modules is very low. In fact, we can say it's close to 0, since I can remove any one of them and get something that I like better. So what's next in the world? Well, this is platforms and bottlenecks. So let's go back in history. 50 years ago, there were many separate technical systems operated by different firms. That's the Chandlerian idea. All the big firms have big production systems, and they're all separate, and they each create products. Today, in the space of information technology, I believe we are moving, this is convergence, we are moving towards one large interoperable technical system. We expect all of our digital artifacts to work with each other, even though they are modules and they are made up of modules, and it's modules all the way down. And also, this large interoperable technical system is made up of many platforms. So there are many cases in which you build something on top of something else. let me say that when I was starting out in this field, a platform was a way a firm organized its production system. And it was only after Annabelle and Michael Cusimano wrote their book on platform leadership that we became aware that you could have platforms that supported external innovation. And then Rocher and Tirole got a hold of the idea, and suddenly we had platforms that could be multi-sided markets. And then there was much discussion trying to reconcile. Joel was part of that debate as well. Much discussion trying to work out these three different definitions. I will say that I've Google search platform, and the platform as an internal production system beats out all the other definitions of platform by a factor of about 10 to 1. So the internet has spoken about this. But so the Chandlerian firms, I claim, are not well suited to the dynamics of modular systems because, and this is Chandler's fundamental argument, they evolved to manage high flow-through production systems. So this is a graphic of a production system, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6. John Paul McDuffie is here. You know, this is auto, is this autos? Sort of, more or less. And hundreds of steps go into, and this flow through is managed, Chandler claimed, via planning. Why? Because if this flow is unbalanced, and there are other operations management people here as well, if this flow is unbalanced, guess what? You only get whatever the minimum size of these stages is. You have a capacity constraint, a bottleneck, at the point where you have the least stuff able to go through. And so, yeah, you got a plan. Because among other things, surfeits. So you'd like to have each member of each stage, people respond, working as hard as they can, except you don't want that. You don't want high power incentives because extra production any place except at the bottleneck is nothing more or less than work in process inventory. And work in process inventory is waste and expensive. So you want everything but the bottleneck to be working at less than full capacity, to have slack in it, and you're just going to accept that. Well, you don't need high power incentives at every step to optimize a system like this. But you do have to plan, because somebody has to say, we're going to make this much at each step of the way. The new challenge is really very different. This is a graphic that shows kind of what I think of as my computer system. I now have like a computer system with a PC, I have a tablet, and I have a mobile phone. And Randy, my husband, has a Chromebook. So what we're doing here is you're mixing and matching all these pieces, recombining them in different ways, and we all do it our own way. Each of us has our own favorite way of organizing our system. So this is small pieces loosely joined. Loosely joined because somebody else makes them, they put them out there, and I get to decide as the system integrator user what I want to put on my machines, what I want to use on an everyday basis. Now, I maintain that traditional firms do not have capabilities to modularize because open source communities do it better. They really don't have capabilities to experiment. Complementers and contests are both better ways of implementing a highly experimental, unknown set of, some way of exploring a design space to find out what the best way of doing things, not in a large firm with planning. So complementers and contests do it better. And then you need to test and select outcomes, and frankly, crowds and users do it better. And so this is like 0 for 3 on the large firms in terms of how do you manage a modular recombinant system of small pieces loosely joined? Well, you're not going to be very good at it. I saw Mike Tushman give a talk a couple of 10 days ago where he said, what do I say to these large firms? And I wanted to say, you tell them, just get out of the way. And because they can't do it, many of them. My colleague Rajiv Lal has a new book about how Amazon is basically disrupting the big box retailers. And one of his recommendations is, don't try to figure out your way into the future. Just manage for cash flow and shrink yourself down. And maybe you're going to shrink yourself down to 0, and that's just fine. The other thing you have to do is you have to protect access to IP without owning it, and frankly, the GNU public license does that better than any firm's IP lawyers and legal department does. So today we're watching many natural, and I'm going to end here, we're watching many natural experiments. I'm going to try to write design rules too, but hoping things have settled down. There's still new stuff coming out and new things to learn. So some firms got the idea that maybe they could make a virtue of necessity and embrace this new world and try to create modular systems, but encourage invite other people to join their modular systems. And then they try to figure out some way of making money in the process. So this is a schematic of an iPhone platform controlled by Apple. And each of these boxes, and this is way smaller than the actual number of modules in the system, because you've got to be thinking of all the components of the handset and all the apps and all the songs and all the things you might download. But the thing to notice here is that the hardware is modular in production, but not modular in use. It comes into that handset. The software is modular in use because people don't want you mucking around with what choices do they have in terms of software. But it's funneled through the App Store. And so Apple is coded in yellow, has almost a complete ring between where the work gets done and the end users. And that ring is a position of strategic advantage. It is control of a complicated and large strategic bottleneck, but it is a bottleneck, and a ring of control around the user. This is the natural experiment going on. This is Android, a platform sponsored but not controlled very well by Google. And here yellow is again the focal firm, the Google, so they control some design and they control the search engine. And everything else is kind of out there for people to join if they want. There's a lot more blue, which is open source, so a lot more stuff is out there available to everyone to use or not use. And there are lots and lots of people have joined this system. So what do we know? It is more open, it is less proprietary as a modular platform. It's probably in some ways better architected, although we cannot be sure of that. And what we know so far is who get rich? Well, Apple's getting rich. Who's growing faster? Android is growing faster. And can both survive? I don't know. I read blogs every day coming out on either side. But we're watching with interest. I hope you are watching and that you'll take some of the lens of modularity and complementarity and organizational structure with you out of this room. And I want to thank you from the very bottom of my heart for this very great honor, and especially thank all the friends and colleagues and people who have helped me on this journey to get here. Thanks so very much.
So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So BJ Zerger and I will be running around with the microphone, and I will call on folks. And I must confess, since often people are reluctant to be the first to ask a question, I seated Joel and said, could you please at least get us started? So to begin.
Thank you. Carliss, of course, like many of us here, very inspired by your work throughout the years, and also having you validate the idea that modularity and system architecture is actually an important issue for managers and management theory, which when I became a doctoral student in the 90s would never have occurred to me until I saw you work and similar work along that line. So thank you very much for making it possible for people like Annabelle and myself to succeed in this area. But I had a question about your next to last slide. So you're basically coming along saying big corporations cannot succeed in this new decentralized modular world. But Jeff Bezos doesn't make a lot of money, but he's got a pretty big company. And Apple, last time I checked, was the largest market cap company in the world. So therefore, are you saying no big companies can succeed, or only certain types of big companies can succeed?
So thank you, Joel, for the kind words and also for the question. What I am trying to say, and I'm glad you brought up those two examples, big companies with planning are maybe totally necessary to manage flow systems. Although people have found new ways of managing flow, and certainly in the auto industry, they've found ways other than hierarchical, or they're modifications of hierarchy and authority that have created vast efficiencies in the flow system. You don't have to own all of your suppliers, as Toyota and others have shown us. But flow is about planning, and flow is not going to go away. It's there to make the artifacts that need those very structured, very step-by-step manufacturing systems. And I think that's a place where we will see, of course, modifications. Keiretsu is a modification of the old vertically integrated corporations. And we will see, but it's not going to be a whole new ballgame. Amazon, Joel, I submit, is a company that has focused its whole life on flow. What it's good at is flow, so in a way I consider them almost an exception that proves the rule. The thing that these companies are not good at, and they have ways of getting around their inability, is this experimentation and recombination. Now, the old-style companies didn't know they were going to need to experiment and recombine, and some of them may not need to do that in great measure. But in the information space, this experimentation and recombination is now a new game, and many companies have to play it. One of the ways I think about it is, there was experimentation and recombination in the old-style Chandlerian companies. It was called R&D. And the R&D guys were special. And maybe 10% of the budget would go, that was a very R&D intensive firm, would have 10% of its budget in that activity. Well, here in the new spaces, flow still needs to be managed. There's still operations management. Those iPhone handsets do not manage themselves. But much of that is moved offshore, and the balance has changed so that the managers of flow in an information-intensive company maybe 10% are not as dominant as they were in the old economy. So great questions. Apple, I think, they have to manage flow. They also have to manage recombination, and they are brilliant at saying, yeah, in the systems of production that lead to our putting iPhones on the shelves at Christmas time, we are gangbusters on capacity constraints and formal contracts and flow management. But in the space of of applications and music, we don't dictate to our complementers the same way we dictate to our suppliers. And I think that's a difference. So thank you for the question.
If you have a question, raise your hand up high.
Oh.
All right, here, I'll sneak. We'll do Annabelle and then
Carliss, thank you very much. I'm Annabelle Gower from Imperial College. As you know, your work has been a true inspiration over the years, and you have made so much, so thank you very much. Thanks for also supporting my work. I have a question a bit in the spirit of Joel.
Mm-hmm.
A bit of a challenge.
Okay.
So you're saying now we are in this big technological complex system, the internet-based society that we're in,
Yep.
right? And you've convincingly told us that it's going to be much harder for firms, big, large firms, to play in this. And, there is the case for modules and firms that are good at making modules. Does that mean we're stuck with this system as we are? Are we stuck with this system? Is this the end of history? That is what I'm pushing, yeah?
Yeah,
I'm saying
yeah.
to you, let's push the argument.
Yeah?
Who and what forms of societies and organizations are going to create the next infrastructures?
Mm-hmm.
Those that will necessitate a degree of integration that is not simply, thanks to your API, I can have a compatible app. I've been studying, for example, mobile payment, which is an ecosystem trying to get itself together, and that has failed over the last 15 years.
Yep.
Because, bankers and telecom operators and handset makers can't coordinate. So I'm just asking you,
Okay,
about that.
and thank you, Annabelle, and I said this in the PDW that Annabelle and some other people attended, building off of something Annabelle said in that PDW, which is, so how do we think about this new world? And I actually think, going back to my slide on the smithy and the kitchen, that we should start looking for transaction-free zones, and we should start classifying transaction-free zones, of which this luncheon is one, where we're all here, we're employed by different people, we didn't sign intellectual property agreements to come in the door, and we're not charging each other, I hope, for our thoughts, all of which would be characteristic of transactions. So transaction-free zones are all around us. In human evolutionary history, there were transaction-free zones before there were transactions, because the first transactions were Sumer and Akkad in I think it was 6000 BC. But tribes, even apes and monkeys, have transaction-free zones where they get together and help or compete with one another, exchange information, do many things. And humans are really, really good at this. So if we look at the world as a set of transaction-free zones that we create, often transitorily, temporarily, sometimes with longer-lasting effects, then one type is a classic corporation that we've learned in the last 100 years as a society to manage those corporations in many different ways, but they're all quite hierarchical. Bob Friedman and Ezra Zuckerman have a fabulous paper, which I will pitch to you, on what is it about hierarchy that is so attractive, and why is it that the firms with the best performance often have a great deal of tension in how they manage hierarchy, so that they'll pretend not to have it, but at some point they can never get around the fact that the decision rights given out by the hierarchy are loaned and not owned. And that's a lot different than having someone in your ecosystem that you don't own. So my belief is that we should open up our eyes to the transaction-free zones and start developing preliminary ideas about how they differ and what kinds of governance do you want for each different type.
So we're just about out of time, so I'm going to make sure that I have a chance to give Carliss a token of our appreciation. So some of you may have noticed the banners that we've got here, and on the banner it says the Wiley Distinguished Scholar Award. We were lucky enough, and we're incredibly thankful to Wiley for sponsoring this award now. So our lovely luncheon here and the videotaping that's happening is all thanks to Wiley, so we're very appreciative. And there will be on the TIM website a copy of Carliss's presentation posted sometime in the next couple of weeks. So it gives me a great honor to present the very first Tim Wiley Distinguished Scholar Award to Carliss Baldwin. Thank you so much, Carliss.
I just want to say that I'm overwhelmed and came across the country quite speechless and had to make up a speech. But I thank the TIM division, Diane, who contacted me almost a year ago, and all of you for this great honor that means so very much to me. So.
Yay. So the last thing I will say is hopefully we will see you all tomorrow at the TIM business meeting and TIM social, where we will have all sorts of news about what's happening in the division, and then lots of good food afterwards. So take care.